Today we're going to talk about margins, padding, alignment, and floating, and how those are related. And then we'll also talk about the CSS Box Model. So in the next series of videos, you'll watch information that's regarding those important pieces and how to align divs on a page. So first we're going to talk about the CSS Box Model, and you'll see from my files that this CSS Box Model document is located here in the Box Model folder. So I'm just calling it from that location. So you have the actual text editor, and my choice is Text Wrangler, and then the browser that's calling that document, this HTML document. So if we're looking at the Text Wrangler text editor, you can see that I have styles that are set up internally. Remember, you can have CSS styles inline, which would mean actually putting them inside the actual HTML tags inside the body, or you could do internal, which is going to be in the head section with a style section specified, or you can do it as an external file type, and we won't address external file types just yet, but we're just going to start with this in the internal CSS format, which is in the head section, is where we declare our styles, our CSS styles. So just a basic reminder about what CSS looks like is, with CSS we have a selector. In this case, if I wanted to mention a selector, it would be a div here. This div is a selector. Then you'd have a property, and then you'd separate that by a colon, and then you'd place the value, which is 250 pixels, as the value, and then you would separate the different properties and their values by a semicolon. So separate the property from the value with a colon, and then separate the value from another set of properties and values by a semicolon. So that's the standard format, and then of course you have these brackets that declare the actual selector's properties and values all together. So that would make up one CSS selector, and then you've got another CSS selector down here with the name that you've given the CSS class or style, and we'll talk about that. But you can see how we've got ID selected down at the bottom, and basically what we're doing is we've got div selectors that we declare a name that could be a class or an ID. A class, if I was to type this in as a class and call it A1, then basically what we're saying is a class, it creates a custom set of formatting specs that's applied to any element on a web page. So I can apply that to multiple locations if I would like. So if I want the A1 class which I've defined here as a background blue and margin 15, then I just hit save, which is Command S, and then I just refresh that. You can see how two of them now have the same value, except I didn't quite do it right because I have to create the dot that goes in between the selector and the name. So now you can see it's taken on the value of the background blue. So a class selector can be applied to multiple statements and divs. So you can see that it separates it by this dot, and then a style ID, which we've already looked at, that was the default, is separated by a pound sign in the actual class selector, in the CSS selector, that is. And then the div class down here is actually going to be ID. But the challenge with an ID is that it's also a custom set of formatting specs, but it can be applied only to one element in a web page. So an ID is going to be only when you want to have one element that you're applying these selectors, properties, this property and these values to. So that's what we're doing here when we give it a ID of two separate names. We're going to get style properties that are unique to each div. So that'll be important as we look at this in the future. But again, for this lesson, we're just going to focus on IDs. We're not having any duplicate classes. But if you want to create a custom formatting, you can do that with the class or the ID. And then you'll just create this selector and the property and the value here. So that's basically how that works.